Welcome back to What's Going On with Earl Ingram. It's always great to have an opportunity to come before you and to be able to have a dialogue about the changes that continue to happen in rapid fire uh, in our nation and across the globe. And it's always great to have my host, co-host, Mr. Sandy Williams, join me. And been a while, Sandy. Good morning to you. How you doing, my friend?
Doing pretty well. Doing pretty well. I had it's one of these midwinter under the weather cold things running for a while, but it's I've revived. I've returned to the human race.
You know what I always say about the fact that you had that little blip, and because you and I have been protected with all the vaccinations that we should be taking, you're gonna contract something, but it's not going to be as bad. I was talking with a friend of mine in Seattle on yesterday, and he said the flu had him down for 4 straight days. He's a guy who doesn't believe in vaccinations, and so he said after this, I think I'm going to go and get a vaccination. So you know, you can't stop it all, right?
No, and I don't think vaccinations promise to keep you from getting it. They just help you survive it. That's all.
Well, you sound a whole lot better than you did when I spoke to you earlier in the week, and so that's good news.
Yeah, it sounded like Kermit the Frog.
Well, welcome back, and let's have at it. Sandy, there's just so much going on. You've been politically connected for a few years, and you've been around when there were ebbs and flows in the news cycle. But the news cycle this time around, Sandy, I don't know if I can ever remember a time when the ebbs and flows came so dramatically. And you know
Yeah, I don't think there's been much ebbing. It's been mostly flowing. I would say that people can't catch their breath. Every day is some new big. I mean, these aren't just interesting stories every day. It's just something big happening every day or potentially happening, and it's to some extent I think it's a national strategy that's being deployed. But what's got me thinking is, and some of it has to do with just things I've done recently. I watched the movie Nuremberg yesterday, and it reminded me very much of the fact that the norms and that the rule of law internationally is basically a post World War II rule of law that was established, and the international order has complied with that over the last 75 years.
so Sandy,
And
for our listening audience, I hate to
yeah,
interrupt you, but they don't might not know what the Nuremberg trials were about. Can you?
yeah, well, there's a movie they should I think everyone should see it. It's free, but it was the trial conducted by uh, a tribunal which included the United States, France, England, Russia, and the that international tribunal tried the German leadership for the war crimes they committed during the war, and a number of those German leaders were hung as the result of the findings, the death penalty uh, that they were struck down with by that tribunal. But that was something that had never happened before. I mean, the international crimes that might be committed by countries against one another in wars and against their own people had never been the subject of an international inquiry and an international action until those Nuremberg trials. And incidentally, there's a personal note to that. One of my law professors at Columbia University, Telford Taylor, was the assistant prosecutor to Justice Jackson in the first round of those trials, and then he became the lead prosecutor thereafter. And I don't think I was enough in awe of him when I was taking his classes in law school, but Uh, this was a very profound moment in world history. And we seem to be stepping back from it a bit because we're beginning to move back from saying that nations and nation leaders have to abide by some international principles of law. And we seem to be stepping back to doctrines of basically the powerful can do as they will.
Well, the worst part about that, Sandy, is that pulling away is led by our nation.
Well,
It, it,
it is surprising. We've accused other countries of violating the principles that were laid out after the Nuremberg trials and the Geneva Conventions. Um, and and however, we've begun to behave in the same manner by basically having self-declared under some principles of international law, apparently by the administration and some of the primary advisors in the administration, that their view of international law is that might makes right, that power can do as power will do, and that therefore these principles of law don't apply to the United States because that would be a constraint on our sovereignty.
well, the worst part about that, Sandy, is the other nations are saying if they don't have to abide by those laws, neither do we. And
Well,
now you just open up the wild, wild west.
well, absolutely. I mean, that the problem with something like international law is that it's followed or it isn't followed. And then if it isn't followed, the question is, how is it enforced? And basically, it's not had to be enforced in a direct manner because when it's been applied, as in the Nuremberg trials, it was the verdicts were carried out by a system of comity. The various nations cooperated with one another to carry out the justice that was decided upon. But if we have friction, if we have the largest powers in the country saying, we'll defy these orders, then we really have a problem because there's only one method for forcing a country to do something against its will, and that's through the use of armaments. And so that's war. And and so I think that we, as a people, or just as an audience here, ought to consider what the rule of law means and how important it is to our society. Um, just a personal aside, if we look domestically, the United States has not been a country which has abided by strict principles and rules of law for its entire time period. We have a time that we call the Wild and Woolly West, in which much of our country had little or no law enforcement, and there was rampant around the country gangs, gang violence, uh, gang crimes. My father was born in 1905 in Utah, and the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and the Hole in the Wall gang and a number of notorious gang operations were still in operation in our Wild West. And so, my father was born into a time period when there was lawlessness rampant around the very part of the world in which he lived. And I know that as I grew up, I constantly had conversations in which my father would tell me about the importance of the rule of law and how important it was that people abided by law. And of course, he also went through the Prohibition, and Prohibition was a period of national lawlessness. We passed a constitutional amendment making alcohol illegal. And from that point forward, much of the country continued to drink and buy alcohol as they used to lawlessly. And so for the period of what was called the Roaring Twenties, which was also the main period of prohibition, the country had on a social level, and it was sort of like scofflaw. Everyone was jaywalking. Everyone was also committing laws against the prohibition against alcohol, and that led to speakeasies. That led to the Al Capone gang. It led to organized crime in many ways. and it led to a breakdown in the rule of law socially in a large parts of the country. And it wasn't a fundamental breakdown, but it was a superficial breakdown that was obvious to everyone.
So, Sandy, if in keeping with the subject matter that you are talking about, uh, right now, the United States government has confiscated the voting apparatus from Georgia and confiscated the votes from 2020. You're talking about lawlessness, Sandy.
Well, that's sort of the government acting in its own version of declared law. And so that's a different form of lawlessness. I've been speaking more about a vacuum where there is no law and no law enforced. There's the flip side of that, which is a government which decides to sort of make up law as it goes along, and to concoct versions of the law which are strained and unsupported by courts, etc. So but one leads to the other. I mean, the fact is that we had up and after World War II, our country had developed a substantial number of norms in which our society operated, which was not constrained by law, but was constrained by understood norms of behavior. We also had a whole range of laws which were to be enforced across the board in our country even-handedly. And and those things are being tested surely right now. The even-handed application of justice, or is justice something that's to be used as a tool by those in power? That's a question which is a question of the rule of law and its application. And the more that it becomes a tool for those who are in power, the more we lose respect for the rule of law, and the more possible it is for us to all turn our back on the rules of law because we know better. We know that there's a rule of nature that is higher and better than the rule of law as it's being applied. So, my concern is that the rule of law is losing its grip, and it's also losing its reputation in the country right now.
So, Sandy, losing the rule of law inside of your borders is one thing. Losing the rule of law internationally is something altogether different, isn't it?
Well, it is. And the problem is that the two of them, however, line up somewhat together. The rule of law domestically is vital to the operation of our society and the trust of our citizens for one another and for their government. And the rule of law internationally is terribly important because ultimately it's the peacekeeper in the world. And our world, we've suffered wars at various scales, but if we look back at World War II, um, World War II had 50 to 75 million people, maybe even 100 million people in the world die as the result of that war. And that war destroyed economies and destroyed society for a period of 6 years or 7 years. It was a horrible circumstance. And wars of great scale are the result of a world that has a world without order, okay? A world in which power is exerted as its own force. We had our president was asked what the constraint was on his ability to do things internationally, and he said basically thought it was just his own morality, his whatever he viewed as being a proper limit. Well, that's not a rule of law, obviously, and if every country's leader operates with that same premise, they will get to loggerheads with one another very quickly.
Sandy, the worst part about that statement that he made is there were a few people who said a few things about it, but there should have been condemnation from everybody when he said that. And because there was not total condemnation, uh, he can walk away with thinking that what he said, he has the latitude to do that.
Well, I think here's what's happened. We have a country, the United States, which has managed to be, as the result of circumstances and effort, by far the most powerful country in the world. Our defense budget is 9 and 10 times bigger than any other country's defense budget in the world, which does give us by far the most powerful military in the world. I mean, yes, other countries, Russia, several others, can maybe match us with nuclear power. But with respect to non-nuclear power, we have a capacity to flex our international muscle in ways that can't possibly be matched by any other single country. Secondly, our economy is very, very big, and our economy is very intertwined with the rest of the world. And we have the capacity, currently at least, to use financial sanctions in a punitive manner with countries, which could cause them to be harmed materially. And so, if we have a leader who's willing to operate unilaterally and on an ad hoc basis and very preemptorily against a country that he decides has come out in a manner contrary to his desires, he has demonstrated a capacity to damage them. And so people are reluctant to stand up to that kind of power because of their responsibility to their own nation. So we have the premier of Canada, who has decided to stand up and has received unilateral sanctions against Canada as the result. So I'm confident that internationally, at least, people are reluctant to pick a fight that they don't think they need to pick. Domestically, we have much the same sort of circumstance. If people criticize the current administration, they can find the guns of government applied directly to them. Um, we had Don Lemon arrested yesterday. We have various legal actions brought against people who have decided to be critics of the current administration. We've had the CEO of Exxon, when talking about Venezuela and his interest, his potential Exxon as a corporate interest in investing in Venezuela, he expressed skepticism, and the next day, the president indicated that maybe Exxon would be kept on the outside then of any potential value that might be created by Venezuela. So, I mean, we have a circumstance in which the leader of this nation has decided to use all the power, all the tools and powers that reside within the office of the president to fight against those who might be critical of any and all things that are done by the administration, which is an exercise of power, yes, but it also constrains the capacity of the public to stand up because they have to pick their fights.
Sandy, I have to say to you, you know, as an American citizen, and you just mentioned just how powerful a nation we are militarily and economically. And all the other nations on earth know that. And they also know that we only make up 4% of the global population. They're not unmindful that a nation that only makes up 4% of the global population is as powerful as we are and continue to have the most powerful military. In other words, might makes right. How are we, from that perspective and position, Sandy, going to, lambast other nations for stepping out of line, and we want to talk about what they're doing and highlight, for instance, Russia and Ukraine, China and what they're
Taiwan.
supposedly
Yeah.
Taiwan, and yet here we are, Sandy. I mean, If I'm in a different nation than mine, I see those things and I'm like, hey, you're in no position to lecture anybody.
Well, it's
And and,
all
and, and let me make this last statement. And here's the deal: we've been in this position for a long time, but never did we have somebody who magnified it as much as the person who's in office now by throwing the weight around. Okay, you don't like what we're doing, we'll send the aircraft carriers. Oh, send a message.
well. I mean, the problem is that without a rule of law, you end up with the most powerful making the rules, and they can be very arbitrary and capricious, and they can simply be the rule that would be enunciated by the current Secretary of State when he was describing the policies which they would insist on Venezuela adopting. And he said, in the first instance, we want to make sure that those policies are beneficial to the United States. Well, that can't possibly be the primary responsibility of the leader of a country to make policies that are beneficial to a third party nation. And in the circumstance of Venezuela, we now have the United States supporting the vice president who has ascended to replace Maduro, the president who we removed from office and removed from Venezuela. That vice president is still part of the same political apparatus of Maduro, and we are not insisting at this point that there be changes made within Venezuela, which relate to for instance, civil liberties of Venezuelans. And so um, what we have is a new declaration of what used to be called a Pax Americana. I think maybe Pax has been eliminated from that notion, and what we have now is basically a world order that we think can be dictated by America for America. And that's just probably in the long term, when you look at a long perspective, the long arc of history is not a sustainable perspective, because it would have to be enforced by American power. If we're going to ask countries to assume policies which are not, in the first instance, beneficial to that country, then those are policies that would have to be imposed on them, or basically coerced from them, rather than cajoled as the result of a description of how it is beneficial to them. And to the extent that we ask countries to do things that are not in their own best interest, we will find those countries finding ways in the long term to avoid the power and to minimize the power of the United States. And our power is not unlimited, and it is not necessarily sustainable. A great deal of our power in the past has been so-called soft power, which has been the result of the notion that most of the world is committed to democracy, and that we are a leader in that regard, and that we are providing benefits to people, not just military coercion or economic sanctions to get what it is we want. And we're seeing now, quite frankly, one of the results of this, which is a very big run up in the price of silver and gold, and a very big rundown in the value of the dollar. And those two things are related to one another. That the rest of the world and the financial world is looking at circumstances and saying, you know what, we think maybe we're better off getting into the safest of value retention kinds of investments, and gold and silver are those. And so we found the dollar declining in value as the result of a bunch of policies that have been adopted, and also as a result of the notion that people think that there might be inflation in the outcome in the future, and that the dollar is not necessarily such a very good thing to hold on to. And in the long run, that removes the dollar as the reserve currency in the world. And I can tell you that for America, one of the biggest crises we could possibly experience would be the end of the dollar as the world currency.
So Sandy, once the rule of law has been compromised, it's not something that is rectified with the next election. Uh, I mean, with the midterm election, I mean, isn't it a slippery slope once you begin, and it's going to take an extended period of time to try to bring that back into vote?
Absolutely. It would take a terrific commitment on the part of the United States, whoever it is that would become Secretary of State and President. It will probably be necessary to go around the world and forge a bunch of new treaties and new alliances, and to demonstrate in some palpable fashion how it is that the United States can be trusted to abide by such treaties and alliances, because we're currently in the process of blowing them up, right? We're currently in the process of stepping back from potentially NATO, stepping back from almost every treaty it is we've ever signed, stepping back from or potentially violating international treaties associated with trade. And so, the rest of the world no longer views the United States as someone with whom they'll do business on a handshake.
So Sandy, it's two pronged when you talk about the rules of law, and you stated it earlier, the implications of it inside of our borders, and then internationally. Internationally, we realize, just how difficult uh, that's going to be. But even inside of the borders, and the loss of faith by the American people in the government, um, and it's getting worse by the day. And sometimes, Sandy, to be able to see things as we do today through the technology, you see things immediately, conversations and things that are happening, and so it's in real time that you can see these things happening. And and I'll tell you, just the more I see them, the more I read, and the more myself losing faith in the government. It's inside of the house is always more devastation than even outside of it, isn't it?
Well, yeah, the inside, one of the things that happened post World War II, post FDR New Deal, was that we had a whole set of regulations that were designed primarily, at least in concept, to protect the people of the United States. The FDA was designed to protect the people so that they could believe that if food was sold to them at a grocery store, or if drugs were provided to them at a drugstore, that they were safe. It was the good housekeeping stamp of approval that maybe they couldn't count upon if they just relied upon the marketplace, because the marketplace wouldn't necessarily be testing these products and making sure of their safety. And and there were all kinds of the FAA was designed to create safe airways for our flights, and the FCC was designed to regulate our airways with respect to public information. And um, OSHA came into place to protect our workers. And we had all kinds of regulations, which became the foundation for what became called the administrative state, because there were federal agencies that had to be set up to administer all these rules, and also to be expert enough to create the rules, because Congress couldn't be expected to know all the fundamental details of how to, for instance, restrict the output of waste from the production of paper under the Clean Water Act. And so the Congress delegated to the EPA responsibility to make regulations. And all of this was working until it wasn't, I guess, because we've spent the last 40 years with political movements aimed at basically destroying what they call the administrative state, labeling the administrative state the the secret evil of our secret evil empire that is bringing down our capacity to be great again. And so now what we have is, we had the Doge movement, which was basically aimed at cutting great holes in the capacity of the administrative state to operate, and we're destroying agencies, like literally putting them out of business. Um, and so, we finally, I think, have come to the point where the New Deal era has ended, and what is going to replace it, and how are we going to how are we as citizens going to develop a belief that our government is there for us and will protect us.
Well, Sandy, again, I don't want to sound like a guy who has given up hope totally, but you just get a feeling that, and knowing that we've got 3 more years, that and you watch even the internal squabbles that we're now seeing a chink in the armor of what seemed to be a solid, unmovable force that the Republicans had kind of put together. But Sandy, for heaven's sakes, there's one guy and everything funnels to one guy. And we've got a king on our hands because he is dictating to Congress. You're talking about the rule of law, Sandy, and not just, from the judicial aspect of it, but from Congress, for heaven's sakes, even the Congress, which is supposed to stand alone, it, for the most part, knuckles under to one
man. Well, I think in some respects, this is a question of you look at the Project 2025 document, and that they talk there about the desire to have the unitary executive, meaning that something putting much more power in the hands of the president, because the president was the elected representative of the people, and that the agencies that work in the executive are not elected, and the only connection they have to the electorate is, according to this theory, the president. And so the president ought to exert far more influence over the operation of the whole executive branch. And the current administration has used that theory, along with declaring emergencies left and right, to be the basis for the ability of the president himself to issue executive orders on any number of subjects that were never within the imagination of people in the past, matters which could be have been regulated to the extent they are by executive order. And this including the fast and loose use of tariffs for all purposes international. And and these things like the tariff power is being tested before the Supreme Court, but the slowness with which they're pulling the trigger on a decision is making it probably very hard to unscramble the egg associated with United States foreign policy, which has been, to some extent, either it's been 50% premised on military might and 50% premised, or maybe more than 50% premised on the capacity to sanction countries with tariffs as a response to any and all actions by that country which were viewed as being inconsistent with the interest of the United States.
Hey, Sandy, isn't the flaw in the thinking of Project 2025 the fact that even if you put all that power in the hand of the president at best can only get 8 years, and the other side is going to get a shot at it.
Yes.
And so if you've done all of this, Sandy, for 8 years, in this instance, 4 years with Trump, because he can only do 4 years, what all of that can be dismantled. I mean, even though there'll be a lot of damage done, but they can't secure long term unless the system that we are presently in is completely undone.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we talked about that a couple of years ago. But yes, the problem with Project 2025 is that it only works if someone's in power for 30 or 40 years, for a very long term. If with an 8-year limit, you've got a pendulum or a roller coaster kind of style of public policy and international policy, which means that things will be unpredictable. uh, what's good today is going to be bad tomorrow, and what's in vogue today and what's allowed today will be disallowed and out of vogue tomorrow. So as a business, it's very hard to make investments long term with that kind of uncertainty. If you're a foreign country and you're trying to rely on another country in some fashion based on something that you've agreed to with the current administration, you will understand that it's only good for a period of time, and it's not something you can count on. So it would put the United States, from a policy standpoint, in a very precarious position, and also from an economic, financial, and international power standpoint. One of the things that has made us powerful is that, in spite of the fact that we change leaders and change parties, our policies have been, and the norms of our policies have been very predictable, and uh, and they've been predictable internationally, and they've been really quite predictable domestically. And to the extent they become less predictable, we end up with a volatility which is not good for business, and it's not really good for society. And um, yeah, I think that the lesson here is that be careful what you wish for.
Sandy, you have always talked about Tom, Dick, and Mary in this equation, and Tom, Dick, and Mary, who are struggling mightily. Um, there is no life raft or life preserver that's going to be thrown to Tom, Dick, and Mary in the next 3 years, and even possibly even after that, because they've sold so much despair. Here's the other part of this, Sandy: the divide from the rich and powerful and Tom, Dick, and Mary. How does that get healed? How does that get fixed? Because at the root of most of this and the things that are happening, those who have the goal, things are kind of all right for them. They don't. This is not a real big issue for them. And so Tom, Dick, and Mary, on the other hand, it's life or death.
Well, I think the problem is that I can give credit to the notion that the tariff policy, part of underlying the tariff policy, is a notion that we can rearrange the architecture of the United States economy by creating more middle class manufacturing jobs, and that could be done by the imposition of tariffs, which might prompt manufacturers to do more manufacturing within the country, which would otherwise be tariffed if it was imported into the country. However, that's number one, uh, a theory which has to be played out in fact. Number two, if the theory were sound, it still takes a very long time to revise an economy in that fashion. And number three, the short-term returns on this is that it's not only not working, but it might be working in reverse. We've actually had a diminution in the number of manufacturing jobs in 2025. The situation with respect to what it is you might expect tariffs to accomplish are not being accomplished, and the amount of, uh, for instance, the Chinese trade surplus reached a record last year, not with us necessarily, but with the rest of the world. And the people being injured by the tariff policy tend to be smaller manufacturing companies who find it much more difficult to revise their process and to avoid the importation of those things which they were importing in the past. Um, I think the real problem with the imposition of tariffs is that you can't turn the clock backwards ever. And we can't turn the clock back on the world economy, and we can't turn the clock back on the US economy, which is firmly intertwined with and dependent upon the world economy.
Sandy, the worst part about it all is, as you explain it from the perspective that you see it, the architect or the guy who's making this happen is traveling the country right now and telling the people that don't go by what they're saying. I'm telling you that the economy is going great. I'm telling you that the prices are going down. I'm telling you that this is the greatest economy, and all of those different things. He's not even willing to accept, Sandy, that people are struggling and that this is not working. So he's going to travel for the next, all the way up until the midterms, and lie to people about the fact that, hey, the food prices are coming down. Well, the people see that's not the case.
Well,
But the guy who's in charge of this he's not even willing to say, well, maybe we need to make some adjustments.
yeah, I think the issue is that the current administration has had success in the past by telling people not to believe their eyes, but rather to believe what it is they're being told. And we do have an administration now who is undoubtedly potentially playing with the numbers that are being, they fired the people who used to do the data
Right.
collection for the results of economic activity. They suspended the reporting for a couple of quarters, while apparently they got their ducks in a row for how it is they're going to report going forward. So I think that the finance community currently right now is kind of suspicious about the numbers being reported out by the government as to whether or not they're trustworthy, which is a real big problem in and of itself in the long run. But number two, I think that the administration has not always been successful in telling people not to believe their eyes. And I think that, for instance, the circumstances up in Minneapolis have served to cause people to have things that they can view with their own eyes and can decide whether they're going to acquiesce to the descriptions that are being provided to them by the administration. And there's been a gap there and a problem, I think, that is going to be symptomatic of what might happen in the future. I think the willingness of the public to make independent judgments from what they're being told to decide by the administration is going to be a clear reflection of the extent to which the administration might be losing its grip.
So clearly there's a chink in the armor, Sandy. For the first time, we even see the squabbling internally, and especially people who had agreed totally with what they were doing after having witnessed um, what the entire world saw with the assassination of, of two American citizens, the assassination of two American citizens. uh, People have finally gotten to the point where they're not just going to accept it anymore. Clearly, there's, maybe 15, 20% of the people who are going to continue, but they can't continue down this path, Sandy. They finally have to deviate from, the assurity that they had everybody believing that we've got all this, we got it all under control, but you kind of see chinks in the armor.
Well, I think it has to do with what I want to get, the subject that we were talking about originally, which is the rule of law. And I think that the American public has been used to a system in which they could count on the rule of law. And even though it hasn't been that long, it's really been since 1930 that the rule of law was applied in the country, and it has probably been since 1955 that all of the people in the country, including those of various color, could could decide that the rule of law might be relatively fairly applied across the board. Uh, but I think the American public for the last 65 years has been used to a system in which there is a rule of law and norms that can give them some comfort about their personal safety and how they will be treated personally. And I think the current circumstance has dislodged some of that sanguine feeling and has caused an unsettlement amongst the public generally on both sides of the aisle. Because the one thing that is true is that whether you're on the left or the right, it is the rule of law that gives you comfort each day. And there are those who wanted law and order, who wanted the rule of law to be applied more diligently, potentially, but not necessarily unevenly or not at all. And so I think that what we're seeing today is a public that's waking up to the fact that the application of norms and the abiding by norms and abiding by the rule of law is maybe a fundamental premise to having a safe society.
Well, you know, Sandy, people marching every day, and today is the 30th, so there's a don't work and um, motif, I guess that's happening all over this nation right now, and that's really directed at the lack of the rule of law, Sandy, because people aren't believing that the rule of law is going to give them what it's supposed to stand for.
I think the specter of law enforcement wearing masks, law enforcement marching around on the streets dressed for combat, I think that doesn't abide by the norm in people's minds of what the rule of law would look like or how it would be enforced. Similarly, stopping people who are driving simply uh, to test whether they should be arrested without any purpose or without any knowledge that would give them a probable cause is another break in the norm of what people expect. And so I think that the operations of ICE in the places where they've operated have awakened a concern on both sides of the aisle, quite frankly, that maybe this isn't what American society can tolerate, and that it will change American society in fundamental ways which are unacceptable. And it's basically because the rule of law and the norms associated with the rule of law are not being followed, and something else is being imposed. And it seems to be a, a, a rule of law that is premised on arbitrary and capricious behavior by the state.
So, Sandy, here's a prime example of two different standards of the rule of law. In Minneapolis, there's the law enforcement, the police department that is there, and and they've got a standard of what the rule of law is, and then you bring in ICE, and they've got a different standard for what the rule of law is, and so how do you mesh that?
Well, I think what's happened, and I think that the nature, you look at the videos associated with the protests in Minneapolis, and most of these people look to be middle-aged or older. They
Yes,
look to be common
yes.
citizens. I am surprised by the profanity that's being used by both sides in terms of a sort of a lack of civility associated with the protests, but maybe that's what happens in protests over time. But you have a circumstance in which Tom, Dick, and Mary seem to be out on the streets concerned about what it is they're seeing that's happening in their community. Um, and so, there's clearly a public reaction associated with what they see as a breakdown in the social order and in the rule of law.
Well, for heaven's sake, Sandy, they're kicking in doors, dragging uh, elderly people out in freezing temperatures with their with a house coat on and no t-shirt and no socks and shoes. Come on. I mean, that's why the people are in arms, snatching women out of cars, throwing them to the ground, and roughing them. I mean, Sandy, this is unprecedented. I don't know. I'm going to use that term because in my lifetime, this is kind of an unprecedented kind of time. I don't know if it existed prior to me being old enough to understand it, but that is why the people are out there. They know
Well,
this is unacceptable.
yeah, I think that's right, and I think that to the credit of the American people, I think that if you those who see this movie Nuremberg will hear at the end of it the words of the psychiatrist who spent his time trying to analyze why it was that the Germans could behave as they did. And ultimately, he said it's because the people let them. Uh, and and so what's happening in America is better than that right now. I mean, we're not letting them commit what we view as being the conduct of a government acting outside of the norm. And I think it's because our government has not yet achieved the kind of terror that was rampant in Germany. In Germany, you could count on having personal physical ramifications to standing up to or standing up for those who were being repressed. And here in the United States, at least until now, the people who have died so far in these times have not been immigrants. They've been people who've been trying to stand up and defend the rights of immigrants. And
Sandy,
so, it's an interesting assault by government on the people who are trying to stand up to the government. And to the credit so far of the crowds who are standing up, they seem to be prevailing because maybe the government is deciding that it needs to stand down to some extent.
Sandy, the hypocrisy in it is, you know, we're listening to our president say to Iran, we're not going to tolerate you mistreating your citizens, and you're killing all these people, and so we're going to do something about it if you keep it up. Well, we're not slaughtering. Well, we did a couple people, and one is too many. We're not slaughtering thousands of citizens on the street, but for heaven's sake, Sandy, we're doing some unconscionable things to our citizens, and we have always uh, given the image that we're better than that. We're better than the other nations, and yet outside of Iran and some other places, the rest of the nations, including our allies, Sandy, can't believe their lying eyes with what they're seeing.
Well, Iran, it's much like Venezuela. We have to look at through the words to try and figure out what the intents really are. We were saying that we were going to go in and intervene in Iran to save the protesters. The protests have been quashed and they've stopped. Now we say we're going to potentially go into Iran and stop them from continuing the development of nuclear weapons. It's not clear that there's evidence that they've been able to rehabilitate their processes for developing nuclear weapons. And I think those who are international pundits who are looking and watching Iran are basically saying, no, look, what's involved with Iran is that the Ayatollah Khomeini probably has the most fragile grip on power that they've had for a very long period of time, and that this might be the time for regime change, which is something that Israel has long been interested in fostering. And so, I think those who are watching this say, look, don't listen to the words so very much. Let's look for the intent here. And I think the intent is to foster regime change and the excuse is going to be something that is expedient.
Sandy, the just we've been here before. Regime change, right? Maybe not so much in Iran, but they constantly say we don't want to get involved in regime change. But if you run out the Ayatollah Khomeini and whoever replaces them, that's regime change.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
and it's not an uncomplicated process. And sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know, uh, which was the case in Iraq, apparently. Iraq has never gotten back to a place where it's a reliable country for its people or in the world since the regime change process we initiated there. Same is true with Libya. And we'll see about Venezuela. But um, this is a part of the rule of law. The rule of international law would not really permit a country like the United States to simply dabble in the internal affairs of another country to change regime uh, in the manner in which we have carried it out in Venezuela or in Iraq.
Sandy, the the part of it is as we watch it, and we know we're headed towards a train wreck, right? I mean, you see it, and for heaven's sakes, even in the continued discussions with whether or not they're going to be able to come together tonight and avoid a shutdown. It's always we've got to go right to the edge of the cliff, and and right be damned, you know, we're going to do. We can't seem to just for once, Sandy, work together for the betterment of the American people. That's that's where this thing is so difficult. I was talking about this the other day. Anyway, but your thoughts um,
Well,
about the
I'm sort of summing up. I just think that norms were there because they are important. The rule of law is there because it evolved and because it was an important thread of conduct that allowed countries to operate in parallel to one another, as well as in concert with one another. And the same is true within our country. And uh, I think that my father's admonitions to me were absolutely true, that the rule of law is very fragile, number one, and number two, very important, and that its loss is a tragedy and a crisis, and that we're probably in a circumstance right now where it's teetering in every fashion. It's definitely teetering at the international level. In fact, it's probably been broken at the international level. And at the domestic level, we just have a lot of work to do to keep a grip on it. And I think it's something that the American people need to, instead of deciding that the rule of law is somehow consistent with government and that government is inherently bad and therefore to hell with the rule of law. Let's go with what, vigilantes? Um, I think that we need to get back to understanding and keeping a grip on the fact that norms need to be adhered to. And they need to be maybe re-examined and determined whether they're appropriate, but they need to be adhered to, and that the rule of law is vital.
so Sandy. So norms, you know, norms. You don't push Canada, your ally, into the arms of China, right? Norms would state that that's not the right move to make, but norms have been thrown out the window.
Well, I guess that's my point. We have a current administration that has been voted in because I think they promised that norms, which let's face it, we had an American constituency which was frustrated by a lack of activity and a lack of action and an apparent political paralysis. And then the question is, what's the diagnosis that the electorate had for those problems? And norms were a way that people behave normally. Do we insult one another, or do we try to behave civilly with one another? And we developed a political process in which we dropped the norm of civility, and we decided that interpersonal insults were not, number one, entertaining, number two, fun, and number three, a demonstration that we weren't going to abide by norms, and that we were going to be different than others and maybe bust out of the paralysis and change things in an important sort of a way. Well, I think we found out that those who break norms don't necessarily come forward with solutions, number one. And number two, that maybe breaking norms creates a society that is not as comfortable to live in. And the same is true with respect to the rule of law. The rule of law has a purpose. We have to make sure the laws we have are appropriate and they need to be re-examined, but we don't just break them, and we don't just ignore them, and we don't just turn the process of government over to a single individual and their whim, because that puts it totally outside of our control.
But Sandy, when you look and see Don Lemon arrested, right? I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. Uh, you just, what did he do? Well, he didn't. He wound up someplace he shouldn't have been. Never mind, the man is, a reporter, and what crime did he commit? Well, he's done what reporters do, and yet he's arrested for it, Sandy. How do you overcome that?
Well, we'll see what the courts do. I mean,
I know, but
the courts
even
have been
the court,
standing up, but this is all part of a chilling effect of using the legal system as a tool of political leadership, and not just as a neutral tool of justice.
well, all right, we got to leave it there. Man, it's good to have you back. Get better,
All right,
and we got a lot of work to do.
and we do that. That's for sure.
All right. I'll see you later, Sandy. Good to
Yep.
see you. All right, that's a wrap for what's going on with Earl Ingram.